Thank you very much. Stepping a little bit outside of my comfort zone, I guess, to the room full of nutritionists. So please forgive me if I come across as being kind of nutritionally naive. I work on swine behavior primarily, where it does cross over with nutrition. Obviously, we have Brian Rickett, we have Scott Radcliffe in the same building as me downstairs, so I consult the experts rather than pretend to be an expert in something that I'm not. So can diet affect swine behavior? I could have just a single slide to say yes and sit down, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go through a bit more detail. So put simply, we think with swine nutrition management, maybe we aim to maximize output for minimal input. We're thinking about how do we get maximum reproduction out of our sows, and then we're also thinking about how do we maximize the growth potential of her offspring. Food is very definitely the most important resource for swine. Swine, as we all know, will very definitely use aggression to gain access to food or protect food as a resource. Thus, feeding system design in groups, when we're housing pigs in groups, will greatly impact the amount of aggression and, of course, its consequences. Now, when we talk about feeding system design, we're going to talk about not only the delivery system, if you like, the hardware, but we're also going to talk about, if you like, the software, the food composition, and what I'm going to focus most of this talk on is the food composition side of things, and we're thinking about the physical form that that food takes, maybe the flavor of that food, maybe ingredients within that food. So food composition effects on behavior. Well, they might well be intentional. You know, certainly as we move away from individual housing of sows into group housing of sows, we know that the feeding system is a very important factor that can affect the success or difficulties that you get within that kind of system. We know that our sows are restricted fed. They're fed a small amount. Quite often they are hungry. Is there ways that we can increase fiber within the food, for example, to induce satiety, to decrease hunger, decrease the behavioral consequences of hunger? So we might affect food composition quite intentionally by designing diets. On the other hand, we might actually have unintentional consequences. And we'll cover this in a little bit more detail. So for example, I've got in there growth promoters, so ractopamine. Working on ractopamine, we find that there are unintentional consequences on behavior of the pigs that are fed ractopamine diets. What I always like to do when I talk about swine behavior is to just give the audience again a bit of a brush up in terms of natural behavior. So to better understand the consequences of feeding on the pig's behavior in our current systems, we kind of need to take a step back and think about where does that animal come from. So in terms of the wild ancestor of the pig, the wild boar, they live in family groups, small family groups, 2 to 4 related females, mother-daughters or siblings. They have unweaned juvenile pigs. They have sub-adults from previous litters with them. Boars associate with them only for the breeding season. Groups, so family groups will distribute around resources like food. Overt aggression is very rare within core groups. Dominant sows will displace subordinates from choice feeding sites. They get first dibs on the food. Naturally, their diet is extremely varied, and where this has been studied, we can see there's a wide range of different species of both animals, insects, fungi, plants, wide variation. The wild boar eats a very varied diet, so it's omnivorous, but very definitely 80 to 90% of that food is going to be plant matter. It's often very high in fiber. It's very low in energy and crude protein. It's going to be variable regarding with the seasons as well. So you might think, well, where's the relevance? You know, that's the wild boar, we're dealing with the domestic pig. It's really not the same animal. Well, it is actually very much the same animal. If you then put the domestic pig into that kind of environment and leave her be, you'll find that domestic pigs very much revert to wild boar type behavior. They will form family groups. The groups will maintain distance from each other, even when foraging in the same area. So when they forage, average distance between group members within the group is 4 meters apart. Aggression in core groups is very rare again, like we see in wild boar. Just to give a number, 1 event every 2 hours per animal. Again, the strategy is avoidance. Where they have space, they avoid conflict. So to summarize this up a bit, natural feeding behavior. Pigs are, if you like, designed, I didn't talk about weaning, but they have gradual exposure to solid feed and wean late. Studies have shown variation in natural weaning age, somewhere between maybe as early as 7 weeks, maybe as late as 19 weeks of age, until they're fully weaned. They will eat numerous meals over the course of the day. They will eat meals of very variable quality. They'll spend a high proportion of their time in foraging-related behavior. So, of course, we see the contrast. Within our commercial conditions, we have abrupt exposure to solid feed. We wean extremely early compared to natural. They eat fewer meals over the course of the day. They have meals that are high in quality, uniform in quality, and they spend very little time in foraging-related activity because the food is there for them. So that gives you an idea of the kind of the framework that we're working within in terms of the natural situation compared to the situation where we house our pigs. I'm not going to go over this in much detail. Obviously, we have a lot of more variation, certainly in feeding the breeding herd than we do in the finishing herd, the fattening herd. Some sow feeding options we have. We can floor feed, we can trough feed with liquid feed. That's from Sweden, that one. The previous one was from the UK. We can trickle feed. Try and fix the sow in the stall and feed at a slow rate while so she eats, and they all finish at the same time. We can shut her into a feeding stall and individually feed. Free access crates, another UK picture, large dynamic group with electronic sow feeder stations. Lots of straw in that one, of course. And we can ad-lib feed, although that's very much a more experimental type of feeding system. With our weaner grower finishing feeding, really not much in the way of variation. We tend to have, where we have variation, we maybe have circular feeders as opposed to straight line feeders. Perhaps there is liquid feeding. Most of the time we are dry feeding. So less variation in terms of that hardware for the weaner grower finisher herd. So if we think about food composition and behavior, like I said, this is what I'm really going to focus on more, and we're going to talk about things like the physical form of the food, the flavor of the food, and ingredients. In terms of physical form, we might think about, are we going to feed pellets? Are we going to feed meal? Are we going to liquid feed? And if we feed pellets, what do we do in terms of pellet size? There's certainly research out there that looks at these different forms of feeding on the behavior of the animal. This is work from Knut Boe and Greg Cronin. Knut is from Norway, Greg is from Australia. And they are looking at dry feed versus wet feed. This is the same diet, 2.2 kilos of diet, fed either dry feed, pelleted, wet feed. The pellets are soaked in water before feeding. And you think about how long it takes the animal to feed. Well, when the food is wet, it seems to equalize feeding rate among sows. So this is the proportion of ration consumed after just 10 minutes of feeding. And this is the size of the pig on the bottom. There is greater variation within individuals of the same size when you dry feed. There is much less, it's a much tighter line, much less variation. And the speed, even between 100 and 250 kilos of pig, they all seem to eat at very much the same size, same time, same rate. So 100%, a lot of them are eating 100% of wet feed within 10 minutes. Dry feed takes longer. The ramifications for that is when you're in a competitive type of feeding system, where you have variation and you have quick eaters and slow eaters. Quick eaters can very quickly eat the feed that they need, and if they're in a competitive system, they start monopolizing feed and displacing other animals who are slower to feed, and those animals subsequently don't get the amount of ration that they need, and aggression can be high in those types of competitive feeding systems. If they're all finishing feed at about the same time, then that reduces the aggression that we see in that type of system. weaner diet form and feed intake here. So in this study, they are fed either liquid or dry feed just for these first 2 weeks post-weaning. Statistically, it's not different, but there is a numerical advantage in feeding liquid feed here. And in fact, when you then move to dry feed for these other periods, you'll find that those pigs that were fed liquid feed immediately post-weaning, where there's again numerical advantages, in some cases significant advantages of having been exposed to liquid feed immediately post-weaning compared to dry feed. And that extends once they even move on to dry feed only. Something disappeared off the top of the screen there. So this one again is looking at liquid versus pellets, finishing pig diet form and behavior. Not only is it affecting the amount of feeding behavior, the type of feeding behavior, it can affect other behaviors as well. So where they're fed liquid food, there's a decrease in time spent standing, an increase in inactivity, decreases in things like pen manipulation. So in this, we might think about things like belly nosing, ear chewing, maybe even tail biting, which some of these pen mate manipulations are generally thought of as bad welfare indicators. We find that liquid feed can result in a reduction in that. And the authors conclude that they are thinking that there's a greater sense of satiety again with pigs on liquid feed as opposed to dry feed. So again, we're seeing the form of the diet having behavioral knock-ons into different parts of their behavioral ethogram, behavioral time budget. Of course, a critical area that a lot of this work has been done on is around the time of weaning. When we wean pigs, we find this check in growth. In some cases, we find even a decrease in weight. So weight gain, growth checks around the time of weaning. And what can we do to get the pig changing from its liquid diet, milk diet, onto solid feed around the time of weaning? How do we maximize this and prevent this kind of growth check that we find? Well, this is early work done in Canada by Ed Pager, who was at Purdue for a while and now back in Canada in Calgary. And he's looking at things like creep feed and subsequent rate of gain, weight after weaning. Of course, we find that where we do have creep feeding, if we're weaning around 19, 21 days, we're getting very, very little creep feed into those pigs. Even if we're offering creep feed around this time of lactation, if we're weaning at 21 days, it's very unlikely that you're going to have much in the way of feed intake for those piglets. Of course, in Europe, where we're weaning at 28 days, by 28 days, you're finding that there might be quite a lot of creep feed consumption going on. What this shows is that not only do we find there's a lot of variation between litters. So here's one litter with an average of around about 160 grams per day at around day 26. Here's another litter that's only averaging around about 60 grams per day at the same age. Within that litter, we also find huge variation. So getting pigs to start eating creep feed, it's difficult. Litters will vary, pigs within litter will vary. What consequence does that have? Well, where we're finding piglets that are eating creep feed, when it comes to weaning time, how fast do they start eating creep feed? You'll find that those that have, how fast do they start eating feed post-weaning? Those that have been eating creep feed are very quick. So this is like a survival curve. So very quickly, within 20 hours, all the eaters have been eating solid food post-weaning. Non-eaters take a longer time to eat solid food post-weaning. Those that haven't had any access to creep feed at all, again, some of the individuals within those litters take a very, very long time to start eating post-weaning. Where we do offer creep feed, does the form of that diet again affect the amount of intake? This is interesting work that looks at comparing different pellet diameters. You might think that small pigs are going to prefer small diameter pellets of feed as creep feed. They carried out a series of experiments, and in every case where they compared small diameter pellets with large diameter pellets, they offered as creep feed, they found that, in fact, piglets seem to prefer larger pellets compared to the smaller pellets. And here again, we're looking at just a creep feed intake, over lactation, days 10 to 17, 17 to 24, again, weaning at 28 days. We're finding that where we do have significant differences, and we've always got numerical differences, piglets seem to be keener to go for larger diameter pellets compared to smaller diameter pellets, which might be a little bit strange, you might think. The other area there that has been quite a lot of work done on, again, to get these piglets eating post-weaning, is flavors. A number of different flavors have been tried: milky flavors, fruit flavors, banana, aniseed, sweet flavors. Again, this is work done in the UK, I think, this work. And their piglets are fed from 10 days of age up to 28 days of age. They're fed different flavors. The flavors rotate on a daily basis. They're given access to creep feed with these different flavors. Some of the flavors, intake grams per pig, there is a significant difference. Piglets very much seem to like butterscotch primarily. Other ones, intermediate, red fruit goes off the bottom. So they're given access to these feed during the creep period, during lactation, when they're then weaned at 28 days and given access to the same feed, so those that had been fed flavored feed versus those that had been fed only control feed during lactation. We find again an advantage in terms of post-weaning feed intake and weight gain. Where there is significant differences, it favors those pigs that had access to flavor, even though all the post-weaning feed is not flavored. So there seems to be an increase. Get them eating during this lactation period, you see the advantages that carry on post-weaning. This is other work going out of the Netherlands by Maria Oostinga, looking at perinatal or prenatal learning of flavor and feed intake. So they're not given any access to creep feed at all. The only thing that is different is for the sow. She is fed a diet that contains aniseed, either pre-farrowing or post-farrowing or both. And we find, and then you look at the subsequent post-weaning access. These piglets have access to diet that both contains the aniseed, the flavor, and the control. What you find is that at weaning, there is no difference in the terms of the weight of the piglets, but in those first few days post-weaning, those piglets that have had access to aniseed-flavored milk, if you like, from the sow, they are quicker, again, to eat food, and there is a weight gain advantage for those piglets. Even though they don't seem to necessarily go for the food here in this post-weaning, they don't go for the food with the aniseed flavor in preference to the control. They're just quicker to eat in general, and they eat more in general. Other things that she's found is that, again, there is other impacts on other behavior. We see decreases in mounting behavior, especially for those piglets that have had, where the sows have had access to aniseed flavor pre-farrowing. Again, access to aniseed flavor pre-farrowing seems to decrease manipulative behavior in post-weaned piglets. So long-acting effects on piglet behavior having fed flavor to the sow. Now, directly looking at ingredients, a number of different ingredients have been looked at and the effects on behavior. We'll go through these. Obviously, there's been a lot of work done on fiber, and we know that sows have a quantity of feed. Feed requirement of the sow is thus. You think about maintenance of the mother, still growth of the mother, embryonic and uterine growth. And if we let the sow eat ad libitum, she might eat a box kind of that big. But of course, we don't let the sow eat ad libitum. We're always restricting the amount of feed that the sow is given. And so we might expect there to be consequences of that for the sow in terms of hunger, stereotypic behavior, aggression, pen mate manipulation. Work that we've done in West Lafayette by Avi Sapkota as a postdoc for us, work in collaboration with Brian Rickett. And we've looked at different diets. We've looked at control diets. We looked at increasing resistant starch, increasing beet pulp, increasing soy hulls and increasing the quantity up from 2 to 2.2. And here we're looking at sows carrying out oral stereotypic behaviors like bar biting, sham chewing, things like that. We see maybe there's a numerical advantage in soy hulls. We seem to decrease those kind of oral stereotypic behaviors. Really major focus of our interest here is what happens if we feed them these diets prior to mixing them, and then we look at behavior post-mixing. We're looking at aggression, we're looking at bite frequency, fight duration. Maybe we see the resistant starch is giving us some sort of advantage in terms of bite frequency in the first hour after mixing, much lower than controls. Fight frequency is lower than our controls. Then later on it might actually go the other way, but of course these numbers are very small compared to these numbers immediately in that first hour post-mixing. So we can see we alter the diet, we can alter the behavior of the sow. Satiety, again, work coming out of the Netherlands, this work. You look at fibers, you look at different fibers, guar gum, inulin, resistant starch. You look at the different levels of fiber within the diet, low levels or high levels. And this is a runway test. So you look at a feed reward after they've eaten. The quicker they get to that feed reward, you might expect them, the less satiated they are by the feed. So what this tells us is that, well, just feeding a low level of these fibers really does not increase satiety at all, but once we move to a high level, we do see that there is an effect. The speed to get to that food reward decreases. So these sows really are not so bothered for that feed reward. The idea is that these sows are more satiated with this high level of resistant starch within their diet. Beta agonists, I won't go over the mode of action, but ractopamine is something that we started work on way back in about 2001 when I was over at Purdue on a sabbatical. It's also a full agonist for this other receptor, and this can influence cardiovascular tone behavior in several animal models, and we look at effects on neuroendocrines, neurochemicals such as norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin, and histamine. But we started looking at ractopamine, like I said, back in 2001, where we were thinking that there were anecdotal reports of pigs on ractopamine being more active, harder to handle. We carried out our first study there, and we looked at, this is just showing us proportion of time spent active. Pigs on ractopamine were indeed more active. They spent more time alert. We were weighing them weekly before they got fed. We opened the pen gates. The number exiting the pen voluntarily decreased. The time to exit the pen went up. The number of slaps, hits, getting the pigs into the weigh crate, and the amount of time taken to weigh those pigs on ractopamine went up. They were harder to handle. Further work carried out by a graduate student of ours, was Angela Paletto, who's now back in Brazil. We hadn't looked at aggression at all with ractopamine in our first study. She did a whole thesis looking at aggression, and she found that in particular the gilts that were fed ractopamine tended to increase aggression. And she found decreases in serotonin, in serotonergic activity within those sows. So we're looking at this neuroendocrine effect of feeding ractopamine. So totally, it's a behavioral effect that is unintentional, but it's real. Other work that she did was looking at going the other way. If we know that the serotonin system is affecting our behavior, well, what if we could try and boost that serotonin? If we can increase serotonin by feeding, increasing the amount of tryptophan in the feed, is that going to affect the behavior of the sow? And here she's looking at gilts during 3 months of age and 6 months of age, where we fed an increased amount of tryptophan in the diet. We found that there was a reduction in home pen aggression. This is a test of aggressivity, a resident intruder test, again another good measure of aggression and how aggressive those gilts are. At 3 months of age it very definitely worked. We saw a reduction for those on high tryptophan in terms of aggression. This is latency to attack, so they're much slower to attack. They are carrying out less aggression in the home pen, and in the resident intruder test they are less aggressive, and she found increases in serotonin within blood. Other work done, feeding GABA as a supplement, another neurochemical. You feed GABA, you affect behavior. You increase feeding behavior, you decrease things like tail biting, ear biting. We've already talked about linoleic acid and alpha-linoleic acid. This is now in 7-week-old pigs. Here they're finding that if they feed low levels of linoleic acid and have low LA to ALA ratios, they're finding decreases in anxiety-related behaviors, increases in exploratory behavior. So not only can feeding these affect other things, but we're finding there is an effect on behavior as well in terms of the amount that they're fed and the ratios of one to the other. Work done in Ireland by Keelan O'Driscoll looking at a magnesium-rich supplement with the idea that if you increase magnesium, there's some sort of blocking of the sympathetic nervous system. She finds that when you increase the amount of magnesium within the diet, we're looking again at aggression. We can decrease some of these aggressive durations, bouts, and decrease lesion scores, which is always a good indication of the amount of aggression going on. So feeding high magnesium, again, seems to affect aggressive behavior. I know we're running up against time here, so we're getting close to the last few. And then the last thing that we're beginning to kind of pay a bit more attention to in some of the work that we're wanting to do with the USDA, and this is about the gut-brain axis. So this is the idea that the gut microbiota is directly communicating with the central nervous system. And this is possibly through direct neural pathway, through the vagus nerve, through endocrine pathways, and through immune pathways as well, cytokines. This suggests a role for gut microbiota in the regulation of anxiety, mood, cognition, and pain. And so we're beginning to look at this in more detail. But the idea is that it's very much a two-way street. So if you think that everything's going well, there's balanced microbiota, normal gut function, balanced immune system, well, if you start getting stress, it can affect the microbiota, the gut microbiota balance within the gut. This, in fact, can work backwards as well. These guys are there actually producing a whole lot of neurotransmitters. So this is just lactobacillus, and this is neurochemical production. So this is what they can produce within the gut. We think about these things we've come across in a lot of the previous slides. GABA, norepinephrine, histamine, serotonin, dopamine. So the gut bacteria are producing these neurochemicals. These neurochemicals can have a direct effect subsequently on the behavior of the animals as well. And so if there are ways that we can start affecting the microbiota within the gut, we might also then be able to affect the behavior of the pig. And this is an area that we're just beginning to get interested in and to look at in a bit more detail. So to conclude, can diet affect swine behavior? Very definitely yes. It can be intentional, it can be unintentional. Behavioral impact, I think, is very definitely often neglected, except for, of course, feeding behavior, which is important to you guys, looking at the amount of food that pigs consume. Modification, manipulation of behavior by diet can be a potential management tool. We know that within our work on sows and aggression. We know that by altering the diet, we can try to reduce the amount of aggression that we see when we mix sows. This relationship between gut microbiota and behavior stress susceptibility is an area of exciting possibilities, I think, not only for animal production, but also very definitely there is a biomedical application and funding opportunities in that area. And I always end up by calling for greater interdisciplinary collaboration. Collaborate well with nutritionists at Purdue, but just for an example, you do a Web of Science search, you look at probiotics and pigs or swine, you might well get 512 hits, but if you search within there and add behavior, that decreases down to only 5. And those aren't, when you look at them in detail, there's not necessarily much of a behavioral component as well. So I think it's a good idea for us to be collaborating much more than we have been doing. And that is it. Thank you.